Hi, this is Benjamin Denniston with the Lyndon LaRouche Scientific Research Team for the weekly New Paradigm for Mankind show for February 14th, 2015. I'm joined here with Megan Beets, my colleague from the Basement Research Team, and Phil Rubenstein. We're in a different location today because Megan and I were up in the New York area participating in some new expansion of Mr. LaRouche's Manhattan Project, as he's called it. So we're here live in the New York area, coming fresh off of a major intervention onto Wall Street yesterday, and doing the show up here from New York today. So the theme of today's show, which will be something I think we're going to take up over the coming months and elaborate and put more depth into over the coming period. But the theme of this series we're starting is the destruction of 20th century science. What happened to science in the past century, and the need for a scientific renaissance, scientific and cultural renaissance. But to set up today's show, I wanted to start by just emphasizing some of the strategic situation in Mr. LaRouche's recent remarks, which are very stark and important, I think, to put the current discussion into context. You know, Mr. LaRouche said on the show with the policy committee on Monday that in no uncertain terms that we're at a doomsday time right now. This threat of thermonuclear war is on the table right now. Obama is the potential author of thermonuclear war, and this thing could erupt at any moment at this point, given Obama's policy. You know, just to put some things on the table that are exemplifying this situation, we're now committing military troops and equipment to be placed along Russia's border in nations bordering Russia. You know, setting up a situation where a small skirmish or even just a mistake or a miscommunication could directly involve U.S. and Russian troops in some type of military situation, and from there could instantly explode into full-scale retaliation. And as Mr. LaRouche has emphasized, the current thermonuclear capabilities provide a response window of something like 3 minutes. Mm-hmm. So if there was any sign that the U.S. was doing something or the Russians were doing something, then the other side only has 3 minutes to make a decision as to whether to retaliate or not before they get wiped out. So if in a situation where that's the response time and we're advancing more troops and military equipment right on the borders, you're setting up situations where just small things could set off a cascading event, which could just end up wiping out mankind. It's just an insane situation. You know, at the same time, there's a major push to send lethal weaponry, lethal aid into Ukraine. The director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, speaking before the Congress just the other day, you know, stated in pretty explicit terms. He said, we need to be intervening into Ukraine because Russia and China are our #1 adversaries, enemies. So it's not, you know, this is not about Ukraine. Ukraine's not the issue. The issue is Russia and China, but really the issue is Wall Street and London, who, you know, Obama is just a puppet of these forces. So Mr. LaRouche has said, you know, the situation is clear. You got to get Obama out. Obama has to go. He's their puppet. Getting him out is the only way to ensure control of the United States and take down Wall Street. They're already bankrupt. Declare them bankrupt. Take away their power. And that's going to be the only thing that can really stabilize the current situation right now. Get the United States off of this war path under Obama, this threatening of thermonuclear war against Russia under Obama's policy, and bring the United States into a situation where we can reassess our policy and begin actually cooperating with these nations, like we've talked about, joining the BRICS alliance in a new orientation. But just to emphasize, the other aspect that Mr. LaRouche stressed the other day was that these guys are desperate. Wall Street is desperate. London is desperate. What they're really worried about is things like what's going on in Greece right now, where Greece, it just typifies the process of the strategic dynamic right now. This new election in Greece, you have a new government that's oriented towards moving away from this whole Euro system and orienting instead towards Russia, towards China, towards cooperation with these BRICS nations. It just typifies the fact that the current transatlantic system, the Wall Street system, the Euro system is collapsing. It's failing. It's losing its power. And they're increasingly in a desperate situation where they're only tool in the bag, so to speak. Their last option they have is threatening, thermonuclear annihilation against the rising capabilities of Russia and China. So again, it's clear Obama has to go. Wall Street's control over the United States has to be removed. And that's the only thing, Mr. Luce is clear that the immediate survival of mankind depends upon that. That's what our current situation depends upon. Getting Obama out, getting the United States back from the control of Wall Street, from being a tool, a puppet of this desperate transatlantic financial system. Now, to kind of take a step back and look at, from the standpoint of that being kind of the pinnacle of the current crisis, Mr. LaRouche has also increasingly emphasized that if you look at this from a longer-term historical process, what are we really looking at right now? We're looking at really the need for the human species to go through what you could call a new evolutionary stage, so to speak, maybe. These conflicts, these wars, really this imperial system is not natural. Doesn't correspond to human nature. And we're at a point where mankind has to move beyond this mode of existence. Just to put it in blunt terms, we need to get rid of Obama. We need to take down Wall Street. But we also need to make a shift such that we never put in this situation again. We need to move into a situation where mankind, that the relations among nations, the policy of nations, the policy of populations is such that we're not put back in a situation like we're in today. And Mr. LaRouche has stressed that he sees the fundamental issue for that challenge being this understanding of the distinction between mankind and the animals and the beasts. And I think that's part of what we want to take up today from the standpoint of what's happened to science over the past, science and culture and really the United States over the past century. And this is important. People, it's just dominant in society today, this animalistic view of mankind. It permeates science, it permeates culture. And even people individually might think, well, I don't necessarily believe that. They might not think they believe that. They still live in a society where that is the belief. Or if they really claim they don't believe it, the question is, do they have, what's the basis of their disagreement? Do they actually understand the scientific difference of the human mind of mankind? What do people understand what makes mankind different? Is that a conscious idea? They might have a belief like, oh, I don't agree with that, I'm the same as animals, but do they actually have a scientifically demonstrable conception or insight into what it is that makes mankind different? And again, this is hegemonic. I think it's worth, we were talking the other day and just thinking through Mr. LaRouche's emphasis on this, it's worth stating this is the entire economic policy of the Obama administration, this behaviorist economics school. It's explicitly on the idea that we're going to nudge, manipulate, guide people's beliefs based upon these purely animalistic, bestial desires, fears. So it's a completely, the core ideology of the current policy of the United States is premised on mankind as an animal. And you manage large populations of society the same way you'd manage training a dog, so to speak. That's literally the ideology governing our policy today under Obama. And it goes back. I mean, this is really the ideology of the British system that's infiltrated the United States. Another thing that came up in discussing this, I think it's worth, Mr. LaRouche has often referenced Adam Smith's notion of economics being fundamentally premised on Adam Smith's statement, his claim, his core ideology that, as he stated explicitly, I believe it's the Theory of Moral Sentiments is his document, where he explicitly stated that in taking up the subject of economics, how to manage society, it is not the capability of, people do not have the capability to really know the ends, the ultimate ends of their actions. It's beyond the feeble capabilities of the human mind, he states, for us to know what are the ultimate consequences of our actions. Therefore, we shouldn't even try and think about the future, because we're incapable. Only God has the capability of knowing the results, the future results of your actions. It's just beyond our puny brains, our animal brains to understand, according to Smith. And he says, so therefore, all you should really do as an individual in the economy is just try and avoid pain, avoid things you might find painful or displeasuring, and pursue pleasure. Pursue things that make you feel good, that it's enjoyable. And that's the British economic doctrine, based on this animalistic view of mankind. Mankind can't know the future. He can't know the future. He can't create the future consciously. The future just comes about by man following animalistic, bestial desires to avoid painful situations and pursue pleasure. And that's the magical secret of economic growth, according to Smith. But this is the ideology, this whole British system, completely consistent with this more modern expression of the behaviorist school, currently running the Obama policy. And so this is, I think, more of the deeper issue which needs to get rooted out. And in this whole context, what I really wanted to get into with you, Phil, because I know you've done a lot of work in this area, is particularly what's happened to science in the United States over the past century. And this is something that Lyndon LaRouche has a number of times put a large emphasis on, that there was a dramatic shift in science and also culture from the transition between the around the period of the 19th century into the 20th century. That you had a certain ongoing scientific tradition, orientation, which wasn't necessarily perfect in all means, but it has certain valid core orientation to it in Europe and the United States. Typified by the work of Planck, Einstein, as Mr. LaRouche has emphasized. In the area of music and culture, Brahms is somebody that Mr. LaRouche has said represented the last end of a certain tradition. And then you had what was really a top-down intervention to reorient science, to reorient culture in a different direction, in this, you could say mankind is an animal, but in some cases I think it even gets worse than that. And typical is the role of Bertrand Russell, as Mr. LaRouche has emphasized. And you began to have the emphatic replacement of science with mathematics. And you began to have this really emphatic pushing of hardcore empiricism, hardcore reductionism as scientific methods. But the real issue, which I think we want to get at today, is all these mathematics, empiricism, reductionism. The real issue is the issue of the human mind, that these policies express a certain conception about what the human mind is. Is the human mind just an animal brain? Is the human mind just a advanced mathematical calculating device? Or does the human mind have a certain creative capability that's unique to the human species? And that's I think the issue of the fight historically for, especially in European civilization. But then that's really the issue of the fight that we face today, right now. And when we were talking the other day, Phil, you really emphasized that part of the issue is that people have to realize science is incredibly political. There's not a separation. You're talking about, again, this unifying issue of what is the nature of the human mind. And this intervention in science to shift science away from a certain orientation that existed in the 19th century was, emphatically a political shift based upon this imperial view this animalistic view of mankind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of territory to cover, and we won't get through all of it. But I think one starting point, first of all, is to realize that most of the culture today, and I think it's becoming even more extreme actually, believes in artificial intelligence and believes that human beings are animals. It's not even a question. Are human beings animals?
Mm-hmm.
We're complicated animals. There may be strange manifestations that come up in human beings. We tend to worry about things. We seem to be somewhat more aware of our environment. Some people think that all there is to the human mind is that we're aware of ourselves, and in a way that animals are not quite aware of themselves. But that's just a border that you reach if you have enough sensory input and enough complication. They've done, for example, they've done experiments with chimpanzees that after a while do recognize themselves in a mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes them quite a while, actually. They look behind the mirror, they compare it to 2-year-old children, and which gets this kind of business. And they'll say, okay, the chimpanzee ultimately becomes aware of itself. And that shows you that even though they're less complicated than we are,
mm-hmm.
they're headed in that direction, And then you get all the things about 99% of the DNA or 98% of the DNA. I've seen different figures, but it's in that range. Of course,
the DNA that we have is the same as
chimpanzees,
higher apes. Yeah.
Yeah. Or I mean, as I said,
and therefore we're only whatever the difference is.
We're a tiny little bit of our DNA is all the difference that there is. So that's just one little bounce in the mutation or something.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, if you really want to look at it from in some religious standpoints, human beings are as a worm to God. Well, if you take the typical worm that's used in experiments, C. elegans, they have 70% of our DNA.
Uh-huh.
So we're not that far from a worm. I mean, if you have that kind of reductionist outlook, it's only so many steps from single-celled creatures to complicated creatures, and that's all there really is. I mean, for example, recently, this is rife in popular culture. Frankly, if I go through it, people can get a little upset, but but popular culture is full of this. There's a series on the Planet of the Apes. The whole principle of it is apes and human beings are just one mutation away from each other.
Mm-hmm.
In the field of artificial intelligence, you find more, despite what was proven, really by Kurt Gödel, but by Plato in the Parmenides, by Cusa in Doctrina Ignorantia. You can't replicate human creativity with a machine. But nonetheless, because we've got more and more really not that sophisticated, what we have is machines that are capable of very rapid calculation.
Mm-hmm. But again, this is particularly expressed in this shift, this early 20th century shift. We started to get the introduction of early conceptions of artificial intelligence, and then some people ran with that, saying that this is what we can do with these machines is there's a complete continuity to what the human mind is.
And it was proven wrong as early as the 1930s. We can take but today, because of the impressive calculational nature, which is not the point that LaRouche is making, is this ain't creativity. In other words, you can calculate as fast as you want, and you can approximate certain kinds of things and say, well, if I'm fast enough and I can go through enough calculations, I can do almost as well as if I had a creative breakthrough and developed an idea that got me directly to the problem. So people are impressed, and they say, well, this is, and of course it's part of entertainment. I think that's a big part. People have telephones that they can look this up, and they have a massive amount of information at their fingertips, and they think this is knowledge. And it isn't. Encyclopedic knowledge is not human creativity. You can take somebody who knows every note that was ever produced by every musician that ever lived, and it wouldn't make him Beethoven or Bach or anybody like that. So the ability to filter through a million branches of choices is not what gives you creativity. And like today, there's a number of examples of this. Bill Gates was saying that he's worried that when we get super calculational devices, they'll overtake us. This has been mentioned by others of this wired world, Kurzweil. And some of them are saying, well, we got to be really careful. I think Stephen Hawking, another one of these heroes of popular science, was saying, we don't want to run into anybody else in the universe because they're probably smarter than we are and they'll dominate us. So there's almost literally a fear of the inferiority of the human species to these kinds of capabilities, even though we created this. And as I said, in the Parmenides, Plato makes the point that a simple mathematical view of existence, simple concepts like motion and rest, if you try to reduce them to arithmetic proportions, you get paradoxes. You get the paradox of the simple paradox that there's an infinite number of points on a line, and you try to start. Well, in order to get to point one, you have to get halfway. In order to get halfway, you have to get a quarter of the way. In order to get a quarter of the way, so you never get started. That's the real joke. It's a bit of a joke. Obviously, he's making fun of any ideas that you can reduce things to arithmetic or even infinite divisibility. Now, despite that, all of this has come up again. And I would say, as you were making the point, this is pervasive. It's much more pervasive than people think. Monetarism is built on this, the point you were making. The idea that value is embodied in whether or not people are willing to pay more for a monetary interest from it, because somehow this is going to get them their pleasure. And so you can bet on this, you can speculate on it, and that's the economy. In fact, there's a complete coherence between Adam Smith saying, don't think about this, this is in God's hands, and the small government approach. Think about it. What is the small government approach? If people think about the future, they'll screw it up. They'll introduce irrationality, emotion. Stick to the more basic emotions, stick to your feelings, don't have a government, don't have regulation, and that's the ideal economy. Even after the crash of 2008, you have the leading banks, most of the economists saying we need less regulation, when it was deregulation that blew the system out. But it's literally the idea, don't let the human mind interfere, because there's nothing more in the human mind. This is, I think, what I've seen from Lyndon LaRouche over the years is an increasing emphasis, not that it wasn't always there, but an increasing emphasis on, I would say, the knowability of creativity. It's not just that we're creative. It's, in some sense, you can intend to be creative. You can't have a formula because you're talking about something that hasn't been done before. But you can know, in a certain sense, what the direction is. And, for example, the way LaRouche uses the idea of imagination, in a certain sense, it's not imagination like fantasy, or I can just think up, I can put the rear end of a horse together with the front end of an elephant and come up with a strange animal. There is, in the imagination, because it encompasses history, it encompasses what we've done before, and in a sense, it encompasses a certain quality of universality. Fundamental human ideas, principles, are something about the way the universe works that we've come to pose to ourselves as a problem because of where we've gone. And the human imagination is capable of proposing to itself, what is the universe must be like that I'm going to encounter if this is already a manifestation of it?
Mhm.
If I've sent a satellite out and it's begun to get data about the solar system or the galaxy, and now some of these things are posing problems.
Mhm.
What kind of universe would pose that problem to me through these kinds of instrumentations? And so that's how the human mind begins to measure itself against the universe and its imagination, because it's always got to be something that you didn't experience.
Mhm.
In a sense, you're creating the experience in your mind based on what you know hasn't worked or has led to a problem. This is, I think, what Lynn is referring to when he talks about Kepler's approach to the universe, to the solar system. He's looking for a universal principle, and he accesses in his imagination through the medium of music. What must this universe be like to hold this kind of solar system in a universal process that really reflects a certain underlying harmony?
Mhm.
It's not, so, and it's, when I say harmony, it's an actual harmony. It maintains a certain tempering, relations that are not arithmetic. They're never going to be arithmetic. I mean, one of the things that Lynn has mentioned is you got to destroy arithmetic. Now that comes up at the end of the 20th century, when indeed people like Kronecker before Russell, in some ways I think Weierstrass and Russell in particular, as a hegemonic figure, proposes that all human knowledge can be reduced, and it does base itself in Locke and so forth, but Russell nails it, and he's going to Principia Mathematica. It's modeled on Newton's Principia Naturalis, and he's going to have a strict arithmetic, ultimately reducible to arithmetic, not just mathematics per se, but he's saying you can reduce all of mathematics, all of geometry, and ultimately all of physics to arithmetic, because what you've got in Russell's system is basically countable qualities, countable items, and he has a simple set of rules, a simple notation. It's a very, I would say, most of what people think of as logical positivism, which is what Russell puts forward. You start with a certain amount of data. In fact, Russell at one point says the fundamental part of language is pointing. You say this object, that object, and then you develop the relations between them. So it's all sense experience and logical deduction. And of course, deduction, the essence of deduction is there's no more in the theorems than you have in the axioms and the rules. It's just a question of unfolding the tautologies. How many different ways can you put up an equal sign? This equals that, move it around, it equals this, it equals that. And so there's nothing new that you can have in the system. So Russell proposes this, and then of course Hilbert, who forms a certain outlook, not unlike Russell, basically a limited outlook. It's not clear to me how much Hilbert was completely aware of what he was doing. Russell was. Hilbert may have been, but Hilbert says physics, chemistry can all be reduced to a logical formal system. That we're looking for the perfectly complete system. And this becomes a dominant view, even though it's criticized. People will tell you how much they don't like it. It is it's behaviorism. We have this politically, I think, a perfect example besides the economics. For example, who did Obama bring in? Cass Sunstein. Cass Sunstein out of the University of Chicago is one of the leading behavioral economists. Or lest anyone think it's just one person, Ezekiel Emanuel, who is one of the big arguers for Obamacare. The biggest thing about Obamacare is really not what everybody's freaked out about. What is it? It's behaviorism. The whole idea is we can set up a set of conditions that restrict people's desire to use certain kinds of medical care. How we disincentivize it. We make it cost a little bit more. We make them go through a few more gates to get to the care, and people say, "Oh, it's not worth it." It's I got this problem. What am I? I'm going to die a couple years earlier. it's not worth all the trouble. And so you control people's behavior. Now, what did Jen Psaki of the State Department say as you were yesterday? She was asked, are we fighting a proxy war in Ukraine? If we arm the Ukrainians, the Kiev regime, are we fighting a proxy war, Russia versus the United States, in the form of Eastern Ukraine versus Kiev? And she said, oh, no, we're not interested in a proxy war. No one would really want that. But we do want to change Russia's behavior. So we want to give them we want to keep punishing them until they change their behavior. And this is insanity. The idea that you're going to predict Russia's behavior based on a stimulus response version of behavior is just pure nuttiness and dangerous nuttiness. You have to understand I think you have to understand the Russians. Russia has been through a situation that wasn't that far from nuclear war. If you look at the European part of Russia during World War II, they lost 20, 25 million people, maybe more. I mean, they lost some from the Asian sector. If you looked at Western Russia and Ukraine, which was then part of the Soviet Union, much of it looked like a nuclear bomb had hit it. And they fought to keep the nation together. So you can't calculate the way this is being calculated. I mean, if you want a good case of arithmetic, you've got strategic thinkers who are saying, well, we can survive, we can win with the first strike. And they go through some literally arithmetic calculation. We put conventional warheads, et cetera. And then this goes back even to the 50s and 60s, thinking the unthinkable. Well, we're going to lose 100 million people, but they're going to lose 150 million people. So since their losses are bigger, we win. And that's complete insanity. Not just that it's inhuman, it's just stupidly wrong. Because you take hundreds of millions of people and kill them, you're not going to have society left, let alone the fact that the nuclear weaponry today can go a lot further. So you have to see that with Russell, you're dealing with an eminently political figure, and he's clear on it. I think there's an interesting example. A guy named Monk, who wrote a 2-volume biography of Russell, which was somewhat controversial. But in the preface or the introduction, I forget which, he says, look, he's a philosophy professor somewhere in England, and he said, look, when I started this project, I admired Bertrand Russell. He was the great English language philosopher of the 20th century, and also later on a political activist of sorts. And the guy, his name is Monk, says, but when I began to look at Russell, and I'm mostly talking about Russell's personal life, but when I began to look at Russell and what he said and what he did, I was horrified. This guy is not a nice person. He's, close. He doesn't call him evil, I don't think, but he's close to it. There's a whole, Russell once wrote a novel called Malachio or something. And basically it's all about the evil of science, the evil of human knowledge. The human species destroys itself. To say he's a misanthrope is to miss the point by a mile. He hated industrial development in the Soviet Union. He hated industrial development in the United States. He had a completely vicious attitude toward the United States, toward science. In fact, the great debate between him and H.G. Wells, to give you an idea of how, yes, Wells was a problem. Russell had a quality of evil that's almost unmatched, because Wells's calculation was that they had to have secret science, because if the British Empire didn't have it, then they would lose out to the other powers because they would have scientific progress. Therefore, you needed, I think they talked about Alder-Maston, but anyway, you needed secret. This is where classification comes from. Russell said, no, it's too dangerous that if we even have secret weapons production going on, that might leak out. And even the possibility that it would leak out is so dangerous that we don't want anything. What we need to do is suppress science. So this was his entire history, and it started with Principia Mathematica, because he denies any form of the kind of creativity that LaRouche talks about, that Plato implies, that Cusa references, that you see in Kepler. That kind of creativity doesn't exist. He'll admit or allow a kind of existential, what an existentialist would call creativity, which is basically irrationality. It's a form of freedom. It's not really creative. It's just you can do something that hasn't been done, in the sense that Hitler did something that hadn't been done before. You could say he was more efficient at killing people than anybody had been before. That would be creativity from Russell's standpoint. That would be freedom. And indeed, it took Russell a long time. The only reason the British went against Hitler, whom they created, was because at a certain point they thought it might affect their empire. And that was clearly Churchill's view. That was Russell's view. And so these guys, and they ran, I think another important way to look at it, how did it work? Well, they took the idea of truth, and they took it outside of the sphere of creative human development. Truth became what they called foundations in science and math, mainly mathematics, at the end of the 19th century. One of the people they attacked was Riemann. In fact, one of the big disputes was with Riemann over the so-called Dirichlet principle, where people like Weierstrass and Hilbert and others said that, Riemann's proof wasn't rigorous enough. Now, there were technical reasons that they could use to say, well, in certain cases it doesn't apply, but they weren't relevant cases to physics or to the real world. So, but they took this standard, and the standard became logical deductive proofs. What's true is what's 100% certain now. We have to have something that gives us effectively complete certainty at the moment. And so they redid Riemann's proof, and they said, well, we've saved Riemann. But what this led to, or was part of, this idea of how do you make a rigorous proof, and that's the standard of truth. That the standard of truth is rigorous logical deduction. And therefore, mathematics begins to reign supreme, to the extent they even destroy mathematics. Because mathematics is a tool. Like any tool, it's useful. It gives you a certain precision in the language and so forth. But what they did with mathematics was they turned mathematics, first of all, and they reduced it to arithmetic and this logical formal structure. And that was the standard. Nothing else was acceptable. Or you took an existential position. You said, well, there is creativity, but it's just irrational outbursts of some kind or other. So Russell, of course, organized, to a certain extent, he organized the Maoists, along with John Dewey in China. Virtually everything he wrote a book on relativity theory, which was terrible. He was one of the people who put out the idea that relativity theory was subjective. There's just an enormous amount of this in Russell. And then I think probably in some ways the high point of this, because if you look at it, by the end of the 19th century, in many ways we'd gone from, to the steam engine, electromagnetism, electricity, electrifying the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, the United States was the leading element of that. Germany was moving in a certain direction. Great Britain was being surpassed. And there is, like it or not, a real history of this, where when certain discoveries are being made, there's an effort by the oligarchy, which became, we had Paolo Sarpi, ultimately it became the British Empire, to claim priority, claim we discovered it first. You know, it used to be the big jokes about the Soviets. Is the Soviets claimed that they invented everything, including baseball. The British actually did this first. You know, they invented the calculus. They ignore Kepler. Ultimately, they're going to say people like Gauss and Riemann were, you know, just not rigorous enough, and they introduce real rigorous mathematics and that kind of science. And finally, just to give a sweep to this, you have the Solvay conferences of 1927 and 1930, where explicitly the idea is we don't know what's going on. We can't, you know, the Heisenberg's uncertainty, and they'll complicate it more, but it has that basically at its core.
This was the studies of the quantum,
right?
What's going on in the very small,
right? Exactly. So you had relativity theory,
all these paradoxes involved,
right?
Coming up.
You had relativity theory, which had been pretty much agreed upon by about 1920 or so, and then you have this quantum breakthrough by Planck, which has been made into a bit more of a mystery than it should be. It's a quantum of action. It does bring up certain interesting problems, but in 27 and then again in 30, the whole conferences revolved around the question of what is this thing with the quantum? How do we incorporate this into a singular worldview that includes relativity and gravity? And you know, supposedly the victory at those conferences was the Heisenberg-Bohr outlook, Heisenberg, Bohr, and Max Born. Okay, this is the uncertainty principle and the idea that all we have is the mathematics, which is basically, you know, a relatively sophisticated mathematical model of what's going on. And you have the one model that's put forward by Heisenberg and Born, and another model that's put forward by Schrödinger, the wave model, and then this sort of statistical model. And then they combine those. Why? How? A guy by the name of von Neumann demonstrated that they're mathematically equivalent. So you have either a statistical model, which tells you is purely probabilistic, or a wave model, which gets turned into a probabilistic model. Okay, and it's mathematically equivalent, so it functions, but it doesn't, as Planck and Schrödinger in his own way, and Einstein in particular, who sort of took the banner up, said, but this doesn't tell us anything about what's going on. So we can use the mathematics, but let's not delude ourselves. Okay, what are the principles behind this? For example, one of the reasons that they make this point is that when an electron in an orbit moves from one orbit to the next, when it either emits or absorbs a packet, a quantum of action, it's random. You can never tell when that's going to happen. Okay. Now, we can build a model that approximates the randomness. That's what von Neumann did. Now, but the question is, okay, we can use that, but what is the process going on? Now, Einstein and Planck say we should be looking into this. The other people say we can't. There's nowhere we can go. That's it. It's a complete mathematical model, and that's that. And that's all science is today, is essentially filling out certain models that derive from this. And are there anomalies? Yes. But do we pay attention to them? Not really. We wait until we can fit them into this model. We're looking to find the dark matter that fits the Big Bang theory. We looked for the Higgs boson, for the Standard Model theory. It's all statistical. There's no causality. There's no principle in it. And we have at hand now something totally different. For example, what does it mean to be random? If that's the case, in a fundamental level, then the universe is simply irrational. Now, why should we stop at that point when we know indeed it's not irrational? There has been a developed course there's been, any way you look at it, even the uncertainty question, by the way, it's all built on the idea that the photon at a certain point is larger than what it's looking for. So your resolution gets messed up. You're basically affecting what you're looking at. So it's a sort of mechanical model of this subject-object question, which has been known for centuries. It's part of the human problem. You have to think of yourself as being in the system and out of the system at the same time. That's where all the paradoxes come from. Yeah, I'll make a mention of that because I don't want to rattle on too much. But the question of looking at this randomness and say, well, what is the cause of this apparent problem, or how would we deal with this? Looking at universal principles, and this is what LaRouche says: if we go into the solar system, if we deal with the question of fusion, if we deal with the question of antimatter, pose those problems, and you'll find the necessity of creative solutions to these kinds of questions that are going to be not a million different creative acts. It's going to be the discovery of certain principles. What makes and Einstein had some ideas on this. Schrödinger. These things are pretty incomplete. I think you'd have to begin to look at it from the standpoint of Vernadsky. What is it in the abiotic that really shows you that the abiotic is beginning to appear non-abiotic? It has a quality of life in it. What in life begins to appear like creativity? But you can't reduce creativity to that. So this is why Lynn, I think, is so focused on this idea of creativity per se.
Right.
And then what you'll find, that is the substance of the universe. This is what you were talking to Bruce about a couple of weeks ago. That indeed it's the move from one apparent system to another. It's that violates the second law of thermodynamics as it's otherwise developed. The second law works within any given system. But we're not dealing with systems. Those systems are created by certain principles. And then the question is, what happens in human beings have a quality of universality. We can take our entire universe of ideas and subsume them within certain principles. Now, once we've set that system up, we then reflect on the system. Usually we do it by certain kinds of actions that test the borders of that system. But we think that way. It's a certain view of self-consciousness. That produces all the paradoxes. That's why you're never going to have a complete, consistent system. Because you can always ask the question, what about the system as a whole? And the system will never tell you about the system as a whole. It's incapable of talking about itself in that way. We do. So that's what I mean when I say we're both inside and outside the system at the same time. That's why I think some of these geometric paradoxes fascinate people. The Klein bottle, the Mobius strip. You seem to be doing something very funny. And that's what the mind does all the time, just as a simple example. And that's what we have to train and develop. That's what's been lost. One of the things I've seen, for example, the idea you can take computers and take them into poor neighborhoods. And if you buy a computer for every kid in the neighborhood, they're going to get smart because they play with the computer. And in fact, there was one study, they don't get smarter, they get dumber. They're talking to a computer. And the computer, they're developing a language of interacting with the computer. Now, computers can do wonderful things, but they're not great conversationalists. So you have to, in fact, I would say mathematics, if someone really believes that you can reduce the universe to arithmetic, they're going to be a little autistic in the most general sense. They're living in a world with a very barren language, with a very limited scope, and they're reduced to that. So these kids are not going to be improved by iPhones and tablets under better circumstances. Maybe they can be helped by it. But
if it's a tool for something.
Yeah, if this is their education, if this is supposed to be the core of making them smarter, it's never going to happen. So this question of what Russell did with the Principia, and then this Solvay period, which kind of shut off. If you think about it, there's been no significant theoretical advance in science at all. And I don't just mean physics. A lot of the work that was being done in biology in the early third of the 20th century stopped. Why? Because everything was reduced to molecular biology, genetics. So biology was left behind. We've had some nice things done in medicine, but no real breakthroughs on human physiology, so on and so forth. Not a deeper understanding of what life is itself. The way Vernadsky goes at it, the way Lynn has indicated we should go at it. It's all been stopped by this reduction of everything essentially to arithmetic, which has no basis. Gödel did the nice thing of proving, and I think one of the things we've missed, Gödel proved that no system is consistent and complete, to put it in its simplest terms. Really what it amounts to is there's no complete system. You're always going to be in the situation, even formally, of generating the basis for a new system. Now, you ask yourself, how is it that we're still dealing with this idea of artificial intelligence? Since this was done in 1931, nobody has really challenged the proof. They challenge what it means. Okay. Now, what really happened in the mid-30s is a bunch of people decided that if you could prove that all of the mechanical or formal ways of calculating something are equivalent. And that's what they did. You have something called the lambda algorithm, Markov chains. They're all algorithms. They're all basically they can all be reduced to recursive functions. Something like compound interest, where the conclusion of the calculation then gets plugged back in as the argument of the function. And you just keep doing this, and it gives you a certain feedback loop. So once they discovered that a Turing machine, a recursive function, certain other kinds of algorithms, all converge on the same set of truths, then they said, okay, that's it. In other words, they did the inverse. They said human intelligence is limited to this, because that's all that can be certain. And that's been the reigning outlook. It came together, actually, there were a couple of significant conferences after World War II, 1947, on this universal science and so forth. A lot of names that people wouldn't generally know. Rudolf Carnap, Alfred Tarski, and so on. And this was sort of became the accepted view. This is really, at least in terms of what I've seen of some of Lyndon LaRouche's biography, he took this on explicitly in 48 in the economic theory of people like Shannon, Norbert Wiener on information theory. He made this, his objective was to demonstrate the fallaciousness of this description of human creativity, of the human individual, as compared to real. And Lynn committed himself to comprehending what real creativity is, not just using the word, okay, we're doing new things. And that's been the battle. This is the British outlook. It's monetarism, it's behaviorism. And I think it's also why Lynn is so emphatic on what the Chinese are doing, because implicitly they're taking a Keplerian view. What is the nature of the solar system? Where do we have to go to find out what that nature is? How do we develop the human species on Earth, giving it the powers to look at these things scientifically? And that's where we need to go, and that's critical to politics today. Russell represented the empire. Russell wanted to bomb the Soviet Union after World War II. So did Churchill. Churchill went to World War III right after World War II. So did Johann von Neumann, who was considered the architect of the modern computer, is von Neumann. And he wanted to bomb the Soviet Union after World War II also. So political, dangerous, but it all rests on a population that really rejects humanity. And as you brought up, there are people who say, I believe that human beings are different, but they really don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
So they're left at the mercy of somebody who says, well, if you're rich, it's because God bestowed that upon you, and you must be good. And if you're good, you'll end up being rich, or some equivalent, or just following rules, following the rites. But the rites don't encompass, presumably, the better part of the religion. People don't really look at that. They think they found a safe haven somewhere by following certain rules, but they don't really know what humanity is and what needs to be done.
Right.
Well, just to throw in there, I mean, in the entire 50 to 60 year period preceding these fights in the 1920s and 30s and the aftermath of World War I, you had an intentional and very concentrated attack first on the capabilities of the mind with respect to classical culture. And I think that's important to put in there because you know we're discussing the imposition of the idea that certainty is reduced to the certainty of mathematics and logic. And that was only possible to impose on a population when you first have killed the certainty of artistic creativity. If you have a population that's so culturally confused, and the culture and the beauty of culture is so attacked, that's the only kind of population that could possibly accept that kind of idea. But you go back into Germany in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, and you have the deliberate funding of these disgusting dramas to try to replace the predominance of Schiller in Germany. You had the funding of people like Stravinsky, Liszt, the music of Liszt, and the people that Brahms and the Schumanns were fighting against, the Romantics. And you introduced the idea of irrationalism. Creativity is novelty because there's nothing more to do with these 12 notes of the musical scale. But again, it was a political thing. This type of music wasn't popular. It was shoved down people's throats. And it created the kind of disorientation where people lost the sense of certainty in the human imagination. And then the experience of the human imagination, which is beyond the sensible domain, which is really the forefront of creativity, which then generates these new systems that we've been discussing.
Look, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on this stuff, but serial music, there's actually a series of steps that you have to go through formally to play through to get to a certain note, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of time spent on coming up with a mathematical model of Bach, and of course you lose. It becomes insane, and then you end up with things like, how can you argue against heavy metal rock, or if it's noise, you have what's his name, Cage, with 4 minutes and 34 seconds of silence. Well, that's not really silence. I think his argument is you can hear the garbage truck going by, and so on and so forth. And this is called music. How can you distinguish between noise and music? You really can't. So yeah, I think all this stuff gets completely. I don't think people realize how destroyed. For example, progress. The word progress has become cynical. Progress. Well, how do you know there's progress? Well, of course, people live twice as long. How do you know that's progress? Maybe it's more consumption. We can go to the moon. Well, maybe that's not really. How can you show there's value in the universe? Well, actually, from a mathematical reductive standpoint, you can't. You have to recognize that mathematics is at its best subsumed by human discovery. You actually change the mathematical language, which is what Riemann did at his best, or Gauss. They changed the language. You had a whole different language, which is what Leibniz does with the calculus. It's a whole different language. That's why they bring in the discussion of the infinite in different ways, because they're introducing. I don't think the infinite should be conceived of as endless. The infinite is the kind of change that brings you to a new outlook on the universe, which changes everything that went before. You can't subsume it without changing it, and you have to recognize that those changes occurred. So we changed our outlook on space when you had Kepler. We changed it again in a similar direction when you had Einstein, and you had to relook at the whole question of geometry, physics, time from that standpoint. We need those kinds of breakthroughs throughout. The idea of a quantum really is more rooted in Leibniz than it is in all this irrationality. So we need a whole set of, we would stand on the verge of a whole set of breakthroughs. If we looked at, we have immense amounts of data, but what if we looked at this data from with a completely different eye, without trying to reduce it all to the Big Bang? Who need, you know, why don't we say, well, maybe there wasn't a Big Bang. There's a whole other question to be asked here. What's happened? You know, I was saying on this thing of, for example, I saw one speculation where, and I think these are all the kinds of things that give you, you know, what you and Bruce were talking about, that you don't look at things from the standpoint of entropy. Entropy is not the direction of the universe, but you have to look at the universe to see how it's moving anti-entropically, or however whatever word you want to use. So one speculation is, from the standpoint of the standard model, which maybe, you know, there are, call them events or excitations, that are even smaller than a photon. So maybe the whole question of uncertainty is wrong if we could create a gluon microscope or something like that, as crazy as it might sound. Who knows? But it's a real thought, and it would open up a whole new era of investigation. For, you know, one of the great people talk about dissymmetry. One of the great dissymmetries in the universe is there ain't enough antimatter. From the standpoint of the standard model, Big Bang, there should be as much antimatter in the universe as there is matter, which means it all should have kind of annihilated itself in the beginning. And there's a big discrepancy. It's not just a small discrepancy. It's a huge discrepancy. You know, so then you get some pretty wild theories. But okay, this is dissymmetry. There clearly is, maybe that's one of the beginning points of life, or even cognition, that the universe is not symmetric, which is one of the big standpoints of modern physics, is symmetry. But what if the universe is, in a fundamental sense that we can talk about scientifically, asymmetric from the very beginning? These are things that you'd have to look into to allow the human species to continue to develop. And so it's eminently political today. I think also, you know, the whole question of secrecy is political. There's no reason for secrecy. We can't work with the Chinese. And there are many scientists who do know that, who are very frustrated by the idea that they're cut off by the Patriot Act and so on and so forth. These are political fights that we should be trying to draw people into.
Yeah, I think Mr. LaRouche's point is that now we're at the point where we have to make this shift in the broadest sense. Mankind's continued existence is going to depend upon moving away from this conception of the human mind as this totally reductionist conception, this imperial outlook as being a, you know, integrated expression of that. You know, I think the importance of this whole scientific angle on it is that you're fundamentally dealing with what is society's understanding of mankind in the universe. And as long as we allow the domination of what you've just been developing for us, this totally reductionist mathematical conception of the human mind as, you know, if anything, an animalistic brain, if anything, just an advanced calculating machine. If that idea reigns throughout society the way it has, as an imperial conception of human nature, we're not going to be able to have the continued existence of mankind. I think that's what Mr. LaRouche sees right now. And so we have to take the current dramatic nature of the historical situation, strategic situation, and look at it as an expression of this. You know, I think it's important. You went all the way back to Plato in this fight. This has been, you know, a long-standing fight in history. You can see of, and it can't always continue to be a fight. There has to be a resolution one way or the other. And, you know, we're at the point where mankind needs to have the premise of a new system, like we're beginning to see with the BRICS, like what China's doing with their space program, oriented towards, again, pursuing in a renewed, fresh way a conception, as you said, of creativity per se itself. You know, just knock off this reductionist stuff. Quit trying to say it's a result of this, it's a result of that. What is it that the human mind does? How does it do that? Let's figure that out. Let's base society on that. Classical art, how do human beings do that? You know, that's the basis of mankind.
Yeah, I think that what we'll get to is the functioning of the human mind, and there's more to know. We can get some aspects of the way it's developed. In a sense, it's evolution per se. In other words, the human mind puts you into a position where you're constantly evolving, almost to the point that evolution becomes the point of what you're doing. It's because the rate of acceleration reaches a point where it occurs within a generation, so that somebody who's born needs to go through 2 or 3 major scientific revolutions in the course of his or her lifetime.
Yeah.
Or artistic developments.
Right.
So that a lifetime, it evolves.
Yeah.
From the standpoint of the human mind. And, you know, as Lynn has discussed it, this is what we mean by the soul and by immortality, fundamentally, leaving aside religious differences that you can have about how to celebrate that and so forth. But the fact is, you can have an ecumenical agreement that that's the nature of human existence in this world, and whatever other worlds there might be. So, you know, we're in a point where that has to be. I think one interesting thing, and I don't want to, from a political standpoint, another important thing to realize, is that one of the things that happened during this whole period leading into World War I, the turn of the century, the attack on classical art, is, in a sense, there were those in the scientific community who thought that science would be a way of bringing nations together into cooperative development. Because there was a universality in science, a commonality of language, even if different cultures. So people like Planck and Einstein and Curie and many others, names that are perhaps not so well known, viewed this as a direction. And they also were cognizant of the powers that were being opened up that would require this. They may not have known about nuclear weapons necessarily. Some may have had some ideas, but they saw this as, even World War I represented a level of destruction that had been unheard of. So, but World War I broke this up. It introduced a great deal of pessimism because whole chunks of the scientific world fell into certain kinds of traps of nationalism of a certain kind. It really wasn't nationalism, it was chauvinism. Or, you know, so they would, you know, the German scientists were pro-German and the French scientists, and they were, you know, the British scientists played the game, and they demoralized the scientific community, so that people like Einstein and Planck came out and saw this whole thing being destroyed. And what came out of it was an idea that this scientific dialogue could not go on a universal basis. When we got out of World War II, there were people who understood, like General MacArthur. LaRouche mentioned this last night, and there were others, but he was a leading voice. He said, we can no longer, here was one of the great military figures of the century minimally, saying, we can't go on. I'm a soldier, but being a soldier is becoming an obsolete reality. We need something better than this. But the pessimism was so great at this point that the idea was considered impossible. And today it is considered impossible. It's all competition. It's all conflict. It's all geopolitical. It's all a zero-sum game. And this is the way empires rule. And you can look at this, and if you want to ask the question, is there a British Empire? This makes the point. Because we're at a critical decision point, because like the Chinese, the Indians, in a different way, the Russians, Brazil, they've come to the conclusion that they cannot survive in this zero-sum game. And therefore, they've opened up a pathway which itself is coherent with the outlook of the original view of people like Alexander Hamilton and the American Revolution. Hamilton's whole point is value is artificial labor. It's scientific and technological development.
Mhm.
It's the human mind. And that's at the core of this. We've, over the last 40 years, it no longer exists in the United States. LaRouche represents it. There may be other people around who are, believe it quietly in their homes, but this is what we have to revive. And the way to do it is to ally with the so-called BRICS nations.
Mm-hmm. And it's a good opening for the whole subject. And I think we should really keep on this theme in the coming months. And but I think this is critical to filling out what Mr. LaRouche has been emphasizing, getting at this core issue for the shift we need. And I think what was put on the table, that that it is this issue of what is mankind. That's the issue we have to increasingly focus on. Science, culture, art, politics, these are all expressions and pursuits of one thing, which is an understanding and expressions of mankind's existence in this universe. And if we don't get a higher conception of that, and not just higher, a truthful conception of that, then we're not going to be able to make it through this historical shift period. So I think,
maybe we have to get people to spend as much money on human beings as they do on their pets.
that sounds like I would support legislation on that. Sounds like a good policy. Well, I think that's a good opening for this subject, and we'll have more in the coming weeks. So thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks.
And we'll talk to you again. Things like what's going on in Greece right now. Where Greece, it just typifies the process of the strategic dynamic right now. This new election in Greece, you have a new government that's oriented towards moving away from this whole Euro system and orienting instead towards Russia, towards China, towards cooperation with these BRICS nations. It just typifies the fact that the current transatlantic system, the Wall Street system, the Euro system is collapsing. It's failing. It's losing its power. And they're increasingly in a desperate situation where they're only tool in the bag, so to speak. Their last option they have is threatening, thermonuclear annihilation against the rising capabilities of Russia and China. So again, it's clear Obama has to go. Wall Street's control over the United States has to be removed. And that's the only thing, Mr. LaRouche is clear that the immediate survival of mankind depends upon that. That's what our current situation depends upon. Getting Obama out, getting the United States back from the control of Wall Street, from being a tool, a puppet of this desperate transatlantic financial system. Now, to kind of take a step back and look at, from the standpoint of that being kind of the pinnacle of the current crisis, Mr. LaRouche has also increasingly emphasized that if you look at this from a longer-term historical process, what are we really looking at right now? We're looking at really. Hi, this is Benjamin Denniston with the Lyndon LaRouche Scientific Research Team for the weekly New Paradigm for Mankind show for February 14th, 2015. I'm joined here with Megan Beets, my colleague from the Basement Research Team, and Phil Rubenstein.
Oh.
We're in a different location today because Megan and I were up in the New York area participating in some new expansion of Mr. LaRouche's Manhattan Project, as he's called it. So we're here live in the New York area, coming fresh off of a major intervention onto Wall Street yesterday, and doing the show up here from New York today. So the theme of today's show, which will be something I think we're going to take up over the coming months and elaborate and put more depth into over the coming period. But the theme of this series we're starting is the destruction of 20th century science. What happened to science in the past century, and the need for a scientific renaissance, scientific and cultural renaissance. But to set up today's show, I wanted to start by just emphasizing some of the strategic situation in Mr. LaRouche's recent remarks, which are very stark and important, I think, to put the current discussion into context. Mr. LaRouche said on the show with the policy committee on Monday that in no uncertain terms that we're at a doomsday time right now. This threat of thermonuclear war is on the table right now. Obama is the potential author of thermonuclear war, and this thing could erupt at any moment at this point, given Obama's policy. Just to put some things on the table that are exemplifying this situation, we're now committing military troops and equipment to be placed along Russia's border in nations bordering Russia. Setting up a situation where a small skirmish or even just a mistake or a miscommunication could directly involve U.S. and Russian troops in some type of military situation, and from there could instantly explode into full-scale retaliation. And as Mr. LaRouche has emphasized, the current thermonuclear capabilities provide a response window of something like 3 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So if there was any sign that the U.S. was doing something or the Russians were doing something, then the other side only has 3 minutes to make a decision as to whether to retaliate or not before they get wiped out. So if in a situation where that's the response time and we're advancing more troops and military equipment right on the borders, you're setting up situations where just small things could set off a cascading event, which could just end up wiping out mankind. It's just an insane situation. At the same time, the need for the human species to go through what you could call a new evolutionary stage, so to speak, maybe. These conflicts, these wars, really this imperial system is not natural. Doesn't correspond to human nature. And we're at a point where mankind has to move beyond this mode of existence. Just to put it in blunt terms, we need to get rid of Obama. We need to take down Wall Street. But we also need to make a shift such that we never put in this situation again. We need to move into a situation where mankind, that the relations among nations, the policy of nations, the policy of populations is such that we're not put back in a situation like we're in today. And Mr. LaRouche has stressed that he sees the fundamental issue for that challenge being this understanding of the distinction between mankind and the animals and the beasts. And I think that's part of what we want to take up today from the standpoint of what's happened to science and culture and really the United States over the past century. And this is important. People, it's just dominant in society today, this animalistic view of mankind. It permeates science, it permeates culture. And even people individually might think, well, I don't necessarily believe that. They might not think they believe that. They still live in a society where that is the belief. Or if they really claim they don't believe it, the question is, do they have there's a major push to send lethal weaponry, lethal aid into Ukraine. The director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, speaking before the Congress just the other day, stated in pretty explicit terms. He said, we need to be intervening into Ukraine because Russia and China are our #1 adversaries, enemies. So it's not, this is not about Ukraine. Ukraine's not the issue. The issue is Russia and China, but really the issue is Wall Street and London, who, Obama is just a puppet of these forces. So Mr. LaRouche has said, the situation is clear. You got to get Obama out. Obama has to go. He's their puppet. Getting him out is the only way to ensure control of the United States and take down Wall Street. They're already bankrupt. Declare them bankrupt, take away their power, and that's going to be the only thing that can really stabilize the current situation right now. Get the United States off of this war path under Obama, this threatening of thermonuclear war against Russia, under Obama's policy, and bring the United States into a situation where we can reassess our policy and begin actually cooperating with these nations, like we've talked about, joining the BRICS alliance in a new orientation. But just to emphasize, the other aspect that Mr. LaRouche stressed the other day was that these guys are desperate. Wall Street is desperate. London is desperate. What they're really worried about is